happens again and again, if it is repeated and you realize this character is using the wrong words. Wrong words, but yet a source of laughter, because when somebody talks about legible bachelor, you begin to wonder whether you're talking about the writing of the bachelor, the writing by the bachelor, the writing on the bachelor, and so on and on. So, laughter could be evoked by the wrong use of language. It could be used by diverting dialogue. Very often, characters are speaking without knowing what the actual meaning is, what the actual situation is. But the audience or the reader knows all about it. So, what happens? So, it evokes laughter. Of course, there could be absolutely farcical caricatures. You know, you might have seen some of those cartoon drawings where somebody the character is a living character, is a living person, probably a well-known personality, who has a long nose. But what does the cartoon artist do? He makes the nose ridiculously, ludicrously long. And then what do we call it? We call it a caricature. So what have we done in this slide, my dear students? What am I talking to you about? What is it that evokes laughter? And therefore, I have called it the sources of laughter. You might notice that I'm repeating some of the points because I'm sure all of you are sitting with a pencil and a notebook in front of you. And it would be a good idea to jot down whatever you think is important. Because remember, as you prepare for your examination, all this becomes important. So you have to listen to the lecture, you have to understand the lecture, but you also have to take down points. Let's now move on to the types of comedy. These first two that I've mentioned, just to draw your attention to, are not going to be the two types that I'm going to talk about in detail. But very quickly, I want you to understand the word farce and the word burlesque. Both of them are kinds of comedy, but not really a part of the types of comedy that I'm going to discuss with you. But let's quickly see what is it, where you have the average, universal human being becoming a victim of circumstance. The burlesque is the lampooning of other works of art, including theatre pieces. Just these two words somewhere in your read-only memory, so that when you hear these words again, my dear students, you would know what they mean. So, let us now move on to the types of comedy that are important to us. The types of comedy that form a part of dramatic literature. We're going to look at some of them in detail, but for a quick glance through the kinds of comedy, the types of comedy, let's talk about number one, Shakespearean comedy. Of course, Shakespeare is remembered for the 36 odd plays that he wrote. Shakespeare is remembered for the 4 great tragedies and the other tragedies that he wrote. But Shakespeare is also remembered for the fantastic comedies that he wrote. Comedies that are as true today as they were when he wrote them. Comedies that laugh at human follies. Comedies that take the reader along with the character. So, we have the Shakespearean comedy, which we also refer to as the romantic comedy. The second one that we would be looking at is the comedy of humors. Please look at the word humor. It is not the same meaning that we use in humorous. No, here humor refers to the fluids in the body. I'm going to talk about it in detail just a little while later. But for the moment, I would just like to define the word humor as used here, which refers to the fluids in the body. The great dramatist who used or who wrote the comedy of humors, who used the idea of humors in his plays, is Shakespeare's contemporary, another great Elizabethan dramatist, Ben Jonson. Don't you remember, my dear students, right in your first semester, we talked about Ben Jonson. We probably looked at his major plays, or at least the names of his major plays. Every Man in His Humour, Every Man Out of His Humour. The third kind is the Restoration Comedy. Remember, the Restoration age in English literature started in 1660, when the English monarch came back after his exile in Europe, France to be exact, and sat on the throne of England again. This is called Restoration. What is this comedy? Why is it so different from the other kinds of comedy that we are looking at? Because it brought with it a lot of French culture. And France and England might be neighboring countries, but they are countries with cultures wide apart, with literature that is very different. And then we have the sentimental or the anti-sentimental comedy, which looks at the comedy of writers like Oliver Goldsmith. Remember, when we talk about 18th century literature, when we talk about Addison and Steele, remember another important writer is Goldsmith. You might remember Oliver Goldsmith for his great poem, The Deserted Village. You might remember him for some of his essays. You might also remember him for his novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. But remember, he is also remembered for his plays, the most important of them being She Stoops to Conquer. These are different kinds of comedy, types of comedy. Then we move on. It's a little chronological if you notice. Elizabethan, Restoration, Comedy of Manners and Restoration Comedy, I'll take them together. The 18th century, sentimental and anti-sentimental, and then we come to the Comedy of Ideas. The 20th century. Who is the greatest dramatist of writing the Comedy of Ideas? None other than George Bernard Shaw. Do you remember his comedies, my dear students? Do you remember his plays, I should ask? Do you remember Pygmalion? Do you remember Arms and the Man? Do you remember St. John? Do you remember Widowers' Houses? Oh, he wrote a great number of plays. But along with that great number, he also wrote his prefaces, because he thought the audience or the reader might miss the ideas that he wants to put across in his plays. So he was one of those dramatists which wrote prefaces, probably as long as his plays. When I say as long as, because when we look at the complete works of George Bernard Shaw, we would notice that there is a volume of his prefaces, just like there is a volume of his plays. And then the last type that I want to talk about today is what has been called dark comedy, black comedy. Some people refer to it as the comedy of menace. Some people refer to it as the theatre of the absurd. All this a part of comedy that was written. I'm calling it comedy, and still I'm using words like dark and black and menace and absurd. Why? You will see as this lecture goes along. So shall we now, having looked at the types of comedy, attempt to understand each type in detail? Let's begin with the comedy of humors. I want to spend a little time talking about it, my dear students, because this is a kind of comedy that existed for a very, very short while. And even in that short period, it's not as if all the dramatists wrote this kind of comedy. Remember the other dramatists that you might remember when we think of the Elizabethan age, the great age of drama in England, when Queen Elizabeth ruled, when culture and art flourished, because it was a period of plenty. Yes, I'm talking of the Elizabethan age, and I'm referring to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Of course, you have the Bard of Avon, you have William Shakespeare, you also have Christopher Marlowe, you also have Ben Jonson, you have Thomas Kyd, you have John Webster, you have Beaumont and Fletcher, and maybe some not so famous, not so popular ones. But if I want to play someone after Shakespeare, I would probably have to make a choice between Marlowe and Johnson. Well, Marlowe wrote tragedy and Johnson wrote comedy. And since we are talking about types of comedy, I'm going to talk to you now about Ben Jonson's comedy. I already mentioned to you in the beginning of the lecture that we are looking at humors. And what is humor? Let's look at what the slide says. The comedy of humors is a dramatic genre which is most closely associated with the English playwright Ben Jonson. What is this word humor? It comes from the Latin word humor. You would notice the spelling, also known as humor. And what is the meaning of this word, my dear students? It means liquid. Now, what liquid are we talking about here? We are talking about the liquid, the fluids in the human body. And this kind of comedy, the basis of this kind of comedy is the fact that the human body had a balance of 4 liquids, 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And this leads to different kinds of temperaments, different kinds of nature of human beings, different kinds of characteristics. So depending on which fluid is more in your body, your character is formed, is visible, is made obvious to those you come into contact with. But remember, I've been repeating the word exaggeration, and I'm saying that word again. And when this fluid is so much in the body, that particular quirk, that particular eccentricity, that particular quality, that temperament gets so exaggerated, gets so maximized in the body that it makes you a caricature, that makes you a laughing stock, that gives rise to, that is a source of laughter in the comedy of humors. When these humors are properly balanced, my dear students, what happens is we have a healthy mind and a healthy body. But it doesn't happen all the time. So what happens? When you have a little too much of this humor, what happens is what Ben Jonson shows us in his plays. What happens? That when this is too much in the body, it gives rise to a certain kind of eccentricity. So, this person acts in a particular way, thinks in a particular way, speaks in a particular way, not out of choice, but because there is an excessive amount of a particular kind of fluid or a particular fluid. Therefore, you could have a phlegmatic person, you could have a melancholic person, you could have a choleric person, depending on the amount of fluid, that particular fluid that exists in your body. Jonson created such characters, and then it is their actions, their interactions, their speech, their interaction in speech with the other characters that gave rise to what we call the comedy of humors. Jonson was a successful playwright in this kind of comedy, in this form, in this dramatic genre. Remember, I used the word genre, and I want you to repeat it after me to see whether you're saying it exactly the right way. Because if you grow up to be teachers of English literature, it would be much better to use a word like genre instead of a word like literary form. Because remember, as a teacher, your knowledge of technical terms of literature and language will become very important, because you certainly want your students to learn them. Anyway, to come back to what I was talking about, the comedy of humors, Ben Jonson created characters who are unforgettable. And even today, when I think of some of those plays, a smile automatically comes, because that is how he could create these characters. So that is the comedy of humors. Let's move on to the comedy of manners. As some critic beautifully put it, the comedy of manners is able to make the real artificial and the artificial real. Let me say that again: the real artificial and the artificial real. The comedy of manners is takes place in, usually within the house, in drawing rooms and lounges and bedrooms. This is where the comedy takes place. It has a lot of intrigues, somebody plotting against somebody else. Remember, this is comedy, and when I talk about plotting, it's not like plotting to kill somebody. It's not like overthrowing an entire regime. No, my dear students, I'm talking about plotting in a social way. How to get rid of somebody from this love triangle. How to ensure that that person begins to love this person. All this is what we see in the comedy of manners. Here, there is deception. When somebody is cheated because somebody has come in disguise and you're not able to recognize the person. But what is interesting about this kind of comedy, my dear students, is very often the person who is being deceived knows that he is being deceived and allows himself to be deceived. You understand this? He allows himself to be made a fool of. Look at that. But then that is the comedy of manners. If I were to give you a list of the comedy of manners, of course, I'd go somewhere to the 17th century. But I would also like to mention here that some of Shakespeare's comedies, like Love's Labour Lost and Much Ado About Nothing, can be considered an example, a good example of comedy of manners. Of course, the century that we are looking at is when Sheridan wrote, for example. And therefore, we would have the example of The School for Scandal. We would also have Oscar Wilde's well-known The Importance of Being Earnest, right? So that is the comedy of manners. So what have we looked at? We have looked at comedy of humors and we have looked at comedy of manners. Before we go on to looking at the romantic comedy, which I mentioned at the beginning, is also what we call Shakespearean comedy. Some of Shakespeare's comedies and what are later called romantic comedies fall into this category because of